Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Greetings, everyone. Very good to be back. I was actually looking forward to being in person, but here we are. This has its advantages for bringing in people from outside the Bay Area. So again, pleased to be here and have this really long-running connection with the Sangha. Probably dating back several decades since the close to the origins, I think in the 90s. So I wanted to explore today the theme of cultivating equanimity and compassion in a time of crisis. We'll explore that and we'll have a discussion. And Mark, we go till, what time should we end the discussion time? Like a little bit before noon?
I think that's good. 11:55 would be fine.
Okay, great. So I think we know that the world is in a state of crisis. There really are multiple crises that we could talk about. Certainly, many of us are very aware of the way that democracy is very much at risk, that there are many forces that are bringing some of the basic premises of democracy into question. One person, one vote. The whole voting system is in question. We know, of course, that the Supreme Court has already taken a number of actions in a way that has very recently deprived the basic right of, especially of women, and that I think, probably very much aware that the principles of the reasoning of the Supreme Court could well turn away the right to marry and love the person of one's choice. I'm sure that's very much on people's minds. We also know there's been a very limited response to the climate crisis, and that things are continuing without very much happening from many of the leaders, certainly leaders of so many countries. And we have the ongoing crisis of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and, Chinese exclusion and so forth, the legacy of racism and the present reality of racism still very much there. We have the reality of inequality, and we have what seems to be a deliberate decision to go against reality. We could say a kind of deliberate delusion, in many ways about COVID, about the 2020 election, about climate. We see that in a large part of the population, what I can only call deliberate delusion. And I heard actually earlier today, listening to a program, maybe some of you heard this, that the former Republican governor of Wisconsin, in the last years, tried to amend the charter of the universities, the state universities in Wisconsin, to remove the mission for the search for truth. Believe it or not, the search for truth no longer proper for educational institutions, but rather what was proper was he wanted to substitute it with train the state workforce. Right? And so we can see that. I was reminded of a passage from a very young W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American scholar and activist. In the year 1900, he said, either the United States will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy the United States. 1900, from W.E.B. Du Bois. And I also thought of Shantideva from the 8th century. Some of you probably know the text, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. In the 8th century said, this world is disturbed with insanity due to the efforts of those who are confused about themselves. Well, things haven't changed too much, right? Because there's that confusion. And so I think it's an important question to ask. What does our practice mean in a time of crisis? How do we each ourselves answer that question? What does our practice mean in a time of crisis? Take a minute or two right now and see what comes to you. We can bring this back in our discussion time, but just see what comes to you in your own, awareness when you contemplate the question, what does our practice mean in a time of crisis? And I'll look forward to bringing in some of those responses when we talk together in a little while. But we can ask, is our practice simply a way to stay calm, stay a little calmer as the world burns? That would be important to stay calm, but that would be limited. Or is our practice more a really vital resource for responding to the crises of our time? And I'm going to maintain the second response that our call them our Dharma resources are really fundamental, I would say, to the future of humanity. I probably would broaden that to really mean the resources of different spiritual traditions, or even of secular approaches, we could call secular spiritual approaches, that the resources of really connecting inner work with our more community-based and social and collective responses, that mix, that bringing of the resources of spirituality is really key to our future. And we could identify a number of different ways this would manifest. We could see the way that inner resources can be helpful in our action in the world. Different resources of wisdom, of love, of compassion, of skillful action. We could see how inner resources are crucial for those acting in the world. How we bring some of the inner practices into our action. How do we sustain mindfulness in the middle of, I don't know, community organizing? How do we bring in wise speech? How do we use our inner resources to cut through social conditioning around racism, sexism, homophobia, and so forth? How do our ethics play a large role? How do we see the world through spiritual eyes? How do we see, the Buddha, 2,600 years ago said, everything is burning. he didn't quite realize how that would resonate now. He said, everything is burning. Burning with what? Burning with greed, burning with hatred, burning with delusion. How do we see how greed, hatred, and delusion manifest not just in our own minds, but also in our institutions and systems? How do we see the world through spiritual eyes? How do we have a vision of what a dharmically based world would look like? You know, maybe connecting with Dr. King's vision of the beloved community. What's our vision? How does that help? How do we bring in, you know, the resources connected with non-harming and non-violence? You know, and how do we especially bring forth the qualities of deep wisdom and love, and the awareness that goes beyond our own individuality and that connects us to everything? How does that stay connected to our action in the world? So that could define a 4-year curriculum. And I've got about another half hour. So what am I going to do? Okay. So what I wanted to do was to take on a small part of that 4-year curriculum and just give a kind of an introduction, you know, after that. And I want to look at the relationship or the importance of developing equanimity and compassion. That'll be my focus. And we'll look at the nature of equanimity, the nature of compassion, and how they relate to each other. I'll do that briefly. I wanted to begin with an account that I heard from a friend of mine, a Vietnamese monk named Thich Minh Duc. Anyone ever met Thich Minh Duc? He's based in San Jose originally, and leader in the Vietnamese community. Used to teach Vietnamese history at San Jose City College, and I've known him for a long time. We worked together some, and he told me of how in Vietnam, you know, before he was born, but in some of the movements, there was a modification of the very traditional way that we often think of Buddhist practice or the Dharma. Very traditionally, it's said to be like a bird that has 2 wings. The wings, as many of you know, are wisdom and compassion. And the bird to fly requires both wings. And in Vietnam, interestingly, starting in the 1930s, they were still under colonialism and, you know, in crisis and needing to act. They said we need to modify that very ancient teaching. And we need to talk about wisdom, compassion, and courage. And they added in courage to that 2-part summary of the Dharma. And that's always stayed with me. You know, I like to think that courage is like the body of the bird as it flies, right? And so I want to look at equanimity, which really brings in more the wisdom dimension, compassion, which brings in the heart dimension, the quality of the awakened heart, and then courage, which brings in action. As I explore how really equanimity and compassion are connected with action. So first, I'll talk about equanimity. And equanimity is one of the beautiful qualities, really, of our practice. It's the quality of being balanced, no matter what happens. It's a very deep, beautiful quality. Some of the most beloved beings that we've known have this remarkable quality of equanimity. I was thinking of, many of you know, Dr. Martin Luther King's speech the day before he was killed, the mountaintop speech. How many of you know that famous speech, you know, where he basically, he gave, you know, a talk about equanimity. He said, you know, as we go into these difficult times, I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing anyone. And he really laid out a quality of equanimity. He said, like anyone, I would like to live a long time, but I'm not fearing anything. And I'm not even thinking about that, he said. And he was actually killed the next day. There's a quality of equanimity that we find in people like King. Maybe you think of, I don't know, Nelson Mandela, keeping a certain balance in very challenging times. Certainly Thich Nhat Hanh and others. And equanimity is connected with two words in the original language. One of them is upekkha. Many of you know, one of our dorms at Spirit Rock is called upekkha. Upekkha is literally means to look over, the sense of being able to see with perspective. There's another word, tatra majatata, which is translated as standing in the middle. So there's a sense of balance. And in fact, the qualities of equanimity really start with balance. That equanimity means the ability to have a balanced, non-reactive mind with whatever is there. And I would say that we especially develop equanimity. This is really pointing to how we practice. Interestingly, we develop more equanimity, especially by practicing with times when we're not equanimous. I know that my equanimity has been developed by hanging out with fear and hanging out with grief and hanging out with anger and getting really more and more familiar with all of these qualities. I would say equanimity is developed by opening to all the places where we're not balanced, where we're not equanimous. And it's interesting, it's interesting that can happen. There's also a quality that we can be with whatever arises increasingly and say, oh, this is happening. Again, equanimity is a fruit of our inner practice of really just being with everything that comes up. And over time, we get really familiar and we can have a kind of evenness where we say, oh, this is happening. Oh, okay. Anger. Okay, anger is happening. Yeah, I know anger. Oh, there's some fear. So we basically don't get freaked out by anything that's happening increasingly. We can be with what's there. There's a kind of another quality is an unshakability that's there, that we can be with what's there and not be tossed around. And especially because we know the constituents of experience. It's like the mountain climber who knows fear very well and just says, oh yeah, there's fear right now. Okay, here's fear. And there's a quality of just being able to be with anything. One of my favorite expressions of this unshakable quality of equanimity comes from Japanese haiku. And one of them, I'll read to you. This is from Basho from the 17th century. And this is, for me, an equanimity haiku. Okay, ready for the equanimity haiku? Remember, haiku are just 17 syllables, so now's not the time to daydream because it'll come and go really quickly. Ready? Here it comes. Okay. Fleas, lice, the horse pissing near my pillow. That's it. That's my equanimity haiku for you. Fleas, lice, the horse pissing near my pillow. Okay, why is that equanimity? There's no commentary, right? There's not reactivity. He's not saying, oh, that darn horse, it's the third time that's happened. Right? So there's kind of a unshakability, that's what I'm calling it. And there's part of equanimity also is this deep understanding, I think, understanding causes and conditions. That equanimity is about noticing why things are happening and having a sense, oh, this is happening because of these causes and conditions, and really, saying, oh, here's why this interpersonal conflict. Maybe I have some balance because I can see, oh, those differences we never looked into are coming to the fore. And, here's my background and my, unresolved stuff. And here's the other person's unresolved stuff. And they're gathering together. And those are the causes and conditions. And that helps me have a little more patience, maybe, and balance to work with what comes up. So there can be that kind of that kind of understanding. And there also can be a kind of a faith, as we've worked with our own way of losing balance, we can have a faith that staying with a given situation, with awareness, with understanding, things can work out. And lastly, I'd say that there's a connection really with being active and responsive. And this really points to some of the ways that equanimity can be misunderstood. I know that some people, may have the image, oh, I'm a Buddhist practitioner, I'm equanimous, I'm balanced, right? And it can be connected with not really wanting to open to certain things. It can even be, there can be distortions with equanimity. And the two most common ones are that equanimity gets disconnected from the heart. And the second is that equanimity gets disconnected from action and responsiveness. And these are, one of the beautiful teachings, some of you know from the teachings of the Brahma Vihara, the qualities of the awakened heart, is that there are, for each of the four Brahma Vihara, loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity, there are what are sometimes called near enemies, or Larry Yang calls them near opposites. And the one for equanimity that's named in the traditional teachings, as many of you know, is indifference. Equanimity I can kind of look like I'm balanced, but actually I'm a little bit disconnected. And maybe I've cut off my heart a little bit. And so, and so the equanimity, I think I would name the two dangers of cultivating equanimity is we'll get cut off, as I mentioned, from the heart and from being responsive and active. And that's why what I'm going to point to is that connecting equanimity with compassion is so crucial. That's why in the teachings of the Brahma Vihara, it's advised that you practice all of them together, not just one. That's why actually practicing loving kindness really is helped tremendously by bringing in the others, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Otherwise, there tend to be distortions. And so we, again, we practice equanimity, I think, by our mindfulness practice naturally develops equanimity. We can grow in equanimity by just being with whatever comes up, getting familiarity with the range of our experiences, seeing what knocks us around, being with, over time with challenging states, being willing to go into them. And the equanimity develops in that way. And another way we can especially look out for things that knock us off. We can have the intention. One of the teachings that I think many of you probably know is the teaching of what are called the 8 worldly winds, sometimes called the 8 worldly conditions. How many people know that teaching? It's a beautiful teaching. It says that there are 8 things which blow us around: pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and blame, and having a good reputation or a bad reputation. People agree? I think maybe praise and blame are at the top of the list, right? I remember when I was organizing one of the summer sessions for the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and everything was going well. We had 100 people, and we did a evaluation halfway through with 100 people. 95 of the evaluations said really good, keep on going. 5 of them were negative. Us organizers, we just focused on the 5, right? We got preoccupied by them. It was like the blame, is like what the psychologists call the negativity bias was rearing its head. And so, so one of the ways we can practice with those 8 worldly winds is to have a strong intention, look out for them during the day. And particularly maybe look out for the ones that are most challenging for us, or maybe linked with a given situation. And so that can be a beautiful way, set in intentions to look out for these winds, look out for praise and blame, or look out for what happens with pleasure and pain. Do we get reactive, grasping, pushing away, and so forth? So a few words also about compassion. Compassion is, again, a beautiful quality. It's developed both by our insight practice, our mindfulness practice, and also by specific heart practices where we, related to metta, where we cultivate the kind heart, sometimes by using phrases, by other ways as well. But compassion is a natural quality that comes when we're present, non-reactive, the heart is open, and we're with something that's difficult or painful, whether it's our own experience or others. The neuroscientists tell us that compassion is an innate capacity of our being, identified with a particular part of the brain. It's innate. It gets blocked. Just like our wisdom, our luminous nature, these things get blocked. But compassion is natural. It's naturally what we do. And I think we all know this quite well. When we're there for our own difficulty or pain, or the difficulty or pain of others, or of another person. It's in the tradition, it's said to be the quivering of the heart. There's another word related to, a few words related to compassion. Karuna is one of them, probably most of us know. Again, one of the dorms at Spirit Rock. And another word is anukampa, which means a kind of trembling, an inner trembling when we experience something difficult. So it's this natural capacity. Again, we develop it when we are, whether in mindfulness or just in being with a situation, in our mindfulness practice, being with others, when we're with something difficult or painful. And compassion is interesting, and this will relate to action. Compassion is both active and receptive. Some of you maybe have seen some of the images from the Chinese tradition of Kuan Yin. In particular, there are images where Kuan Yin has 1,000 arms, and each of the arms, on each of the hands, there's an eye. And what this symbolizes is that compassion, the action of Kuan Yin is the embodiment of compassion, that compassion is both receptive, we're tuning into someone else's pain or our own pain, that's symbolized by the eye, but there's also the hand, and so there's action. And so compassion is both that inner trembling when we feel our own pain or the pain of another, but it's also the wanting to respond in some kind way, some compassionate way. And so, again, much like equanimity, we cultivate compassion in our insight practice, our mindfulness practice, by being willing to open to what's difficult or painful. And that by itself leads to compassion. And I'm sure we all know that well. We open the heart by being willing to go into what's difficult. And we have to be willing to do that, even though it's not so pleasant. Some of you know maybe the poem, the beautiful poem by David White. Those who will not slip beneath the still surface on the well of grief, turning downward through the black water to the place we cannot breathe. We'll never know the source from which we drink, the secret water cold and clear, nor find in the darkness glimmering the small round coins thrown by those who wished for something else. And again, compassion develops naturally, but like equanimity, it has its challenges. There are typical challenges to developing compassion, typical distortions. And we probably know this. One of them, of course, is overwhelm or burnout. How many of you have been in maybe in the helping professions and experienced that? Probably quite a number of us, right? Know that compassion develops naturally, but we can be overwhelmed by the level of pain or what we are opening to, and we have to find ways to work skillfully with that. We also can be sort of cut off in a way from wisdom. And so what this is pointing to is, this beautiful balance. Again, it's expressed wonderfully in the teachings of these four qualities: loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. We have to bring them all together, it's said, and they really inform each other. Equanimity brings in the wisdom dimension. In me talking now about equanimity and compassion, compassion brings in the heart quality, and they balance each other. They really are resources for where, let's say, where equanimity can get lost or out of balance, compassion can help, particularly connecting to the heart and helping with being responsive and active. And where compassion can get out of balance, the cultivation of equanimity can help. It brings in the wisdom dimension that says maybe a little too much exposure to the painful, pull back a little bit, or bring in this approach and so forth. So it's quite beautiful to see that kind of balance. And so I think they come together, and this is really connecting back with the theme of my original question: how can our Dharma practice meet some of the crises of the world? I think equanimity and compassion, manifesting as courageous action, is right at the center of it. And so I'll close just with a few thoughts about that, then we can open up to talking together. And so this balance of equanimity and compassion gives us resources for what we need, I think, in the coming decade. It says, many people say the next decade will determine the future of the planet, the future of humanity, particularly. And so we gain resources with equanimity and compassion for being with difficult states. We can bring our inner practice and our perspective to them. We can have a sense that we can maybe have equanimity brings in especially a long perspective. We can have a sense that we're in this for the duration. I think of a person I interviewed and worked with, Dr. Ariyaratne from Sri Lanka, and he was talking about how they brought practice to the civil war in Sri Lanka. And he said, we have a 500-year perspective, that the problems were 500 years in the making. So it's going to take a little bit of time to resolve them. And so we get this long-term perspective. And we can have also maybe a recognition, maybe the equanimity helps us, and looking at history, that change is mysterious. That equanimity helps us just stay with what we're doing. We get discouraged. Our insight practice can look for, oh, I thought it was going to be this way. But our equanimity can say, I don't really necessarily know how things will happen. I can really have a sense of the mystery of things. And then we can, maybe I'll close by saying that we can rest in a sense of the balance of these qualities. One of the, there's a beautiful statement by a great yogi from India. Some of you know Sri Nisargadatta. He said, love says I am everything. Wisdom says I am nothing. Between the two, my life flows. We could say that about compassion and equanimity. Maybe I'll close just with two other readings. Suzuki Roshi. This is kind of bringing in the paradox of bringing the mind and the heart together. Suzuki Roshi says, from the standpoint of Zen practice, things are perfect as they are. They could also use some improvement. And then lastly, also from Zen, this is from someone who I worked with, Robert Aitken Roshi, maybe some of you know. This is from his text, really connecting, I think, Zen with shamanic tradition. It's a book called Zen Master Raven. He has his character Al says, "What is the right view for the current time?" And the response by Brown Bear is this, and I'll end my talk with Brown Bear telling what we need for our times. Okay, what is the right view for our times? Brown Bear, we're in it together and we don't have much time. Thank you kindly. So let's take a moment and just let things settle a little bit. Maybe something related to the themes of equanimity or compassion, how we practice, how we develop. Something maybe related to your original reflection about being with your practice in the context of the crises of our time. Let's take a minute and a half just to sit quietly, see what's there for you. So thank you. Any sharing of what's been helpful for you for equanimity, compassion? Any questions? Please, Matthew.
Hello, Donald.
Hi.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, this subject is really at the heart of some of the main sources of my dukkha, or main sources of unsatisfactory. I like using the word unsatisfactoriness instead of suffering. I'm glad you mentioned the 8 worldly winds. I think I've mentioned this before in the Sangha, but whenever unsatisfactoriness arises in my life, I use the 5 hindrances and the 8 worldly winds. They're the diagnostics, and then the prescription is the Brahma Viharas. And that's kind of how, at least on a self-help level, I use the Dharma in my life.
Yeah.
For me, in these times, what is most disturbing for me is a sense of helplessness. And so, part of it has to do some of the ways I've been dealing with it is to kind of maybe just kind of reduce my media intake.
Yeah.
Because the media always likes to focus on the negative. The negative bias, I guess you would say, of the media.
Yeah.
But also, I feel like that the other answer to my distress kind of goes into the range of what we call engaged Buddhism. The practice that also leads to some kind of action. And just recently, I've decided. I was at the community meeting for the Castro Theater. And they're basically, I won't go too much into it, but it's no longer going to be a temple of cinema if Another Planet Enterprise Entertainment does what they want to do. But at least at that meeting, I realized, okay, well, here's something. Here's something I can maybe do something about, help. become engaged in. So anyway, I guess if I have a question for you is, what are some ways of dealing with that kind of helplessness
Yeah.
in the face of world events? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, so much. And yeah, I appreciate the hearing a description of your practice with naming how you use the teachings about the hindrances and the 8 worldly winds. That sounds really, really helpful. And also for naming helplessness. How many can relate to that in some way? Yeah, so you see, that's important. So I think there's a lot that could be said, but if I had to be brief, I would say one thing certainly is what you mentioned, is that being careful about how much you take in. I hear this from a lot of people, that sometimes the taking in of more and more information, and we just want to hear that news and get into that, and it can be too much. I've actually done some retreats where I stayed in touch with the news, but watched my own mind wanting to get more. And I found that half an hour a day was totally adequate, but that when that ordinarily I might take in 3 or 4 times that amount, right? And so I think that what you're pointing to there can be really helpful. And I think also what you were pointing to and talking about going to the meeting at the Castro Theater points to, I think, what can be really helpful, which is, and I've worked with some of the people I work with, I've done something like this. People, basically it's choosing a form of action that works with your available time and resources and your skills and gifts, and making a commitment to some form of action. It could be, one person I worked with, we talked and she said, or I said, how much time do you have? And she said, 5 hours. What issue calls you? She said, climate issues. Okay, we'll meet in 2 weeks. I want you to resource, 3 or 4 options for your 5 hours a week. And she came up, she researched organizations and she got a solution. That was 2 years ago. And she's been putting in her 5 hours every week. And I think that can make a huge difference towards inner feelings. There's a well-known line from Angeles Arian. She said, action alleviates anxiety. And so finding something like that, 5 hours a week or whatever it is, maybe it's less, but knowing that you're staying with something, and there are a lot of options out there. So those would be the 2 quick things I would say in response. Other sharing questions? Could be, yeah, please, Tom.
Donald, thank you so much for another dense and actionable teaching. I feel if I could just keep this talk in my mind, day to day, it would help me solve, many of my perceived problems. I'm really happy that you brought up that equanimity is the near opposite of indifference, because, especially as it relates to climate, which you also talked about, we hear scientists debating like, okay, what's the tipping point? Like, what year is it going to be? Or what measure do we use where we come to this realization it's too late, And I think they do that to try and stir us to action and stir governments to action. But it also creates this anxiety, like, okay, well, what if they're wrong and it's already too late, And so, if one takes the view like we're in a canoe with no paddles floating downstream, but there's a huge waterfall up ahead, what are we going to do? And so, equanimity is one thing. I guess what it comes down to is, do we employ our practice to maintain equanimity for ourselves and for others around us in the current moment, in the current year? Or do we also have a role about trying to maintain, compassion and wellness for those in the future?
Mhm.
Like there's this balance, like we can be equanimous even if the horse is pissing next to our pillow.
Mhm.
So how do we balance that need for just being equanimous now and also looking towards the future and those who are maybe not yet born or not yet capable of doing something?
Mm.
Future generations, let's just say that.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, beautiful question, really. I think one person who's influenced my sense of equanimity, who does bring that in, is Joanna Macy. And Joanna has a sense of equanimity as being linked with a very, very long view of life and history. Like it's really identifying with the whole evolution of the planet. And that can be, having that very, very long view can have equanimity. But again, I think there's something a little unfortunate about the English word equanimity, because even I noticed in my body just like 10 seconds ago when I said it, equanimity almost feels a little disconnected. How many people feel that a little bit with the word, something like that? It was a little bit interesting. I noticed something in my body that was like, equanimity, right? And so maybe we need a different word, but what we're pointing to is a kind of balance, that one can be balanced when there's something very painful or difficult. One can even be sometimes, when one's practice is mature, one can be balanced being reactive. That can be I can be, mindful of reactivity. We sometimes say mindfulness of reactivity is not reactive. Interesting, right? And so I think that something like that long equanimity would have a long view, which would include future generations, as would compassion. And compassion would connect us with future generations. And I think that is the motivation of a lot of people. And so bringing in, maybe deepening the equanimity practice to include this sense of a long view of causes and conditions going off into the future, and saying this isn't just about being equanimous in relation to the present, but also in relationship to future generations. But I think there's something that feels a little peculiar about equanimity. What it's pointing to, though, is being balanced and non-reactive, even as we contemplate very dangerous circumstances.
Right. Because equanimity can feel very passive. It's non-reactive, it can feel passive, but what you said, compassion makes it active. Yeah,
an important thing is to distinguish, I didn't mention this, to distinguish equanimity from calm. They're not the same things. Equanimity can be, have a lot of things, moving fast, not particularly calm, but the idea is balance. It's like the sense of an inner balance, even though all sorts of things are happening. And that would be equanimity. So I think it does connect with what you're getting at. Maybe, Mark, are we okay taking one more and then closing with that?
Yeah, I think that's fine. We'll do one more, then close. Thank you.
Mike, please.
You need to unmute, Mike. Please unmute.
I'm actually one of Paul's closest friends, and I just wrote a short bit which I shared with, I think it was with, anyway, sent it to Joe. Yeah. So as far as this topic, since I just lost a really close person, one of the closest people in my life, it reminds me of what would he want me to do now? Or what would other people who departed want me to do? And from their perspective, and I believe they're somewhere else more loving, that's my belief, they would tell me to let love be the guiding principle of my life.
Beautiful.
You know, I have trouble with the news. I was taken away from the news 6 months ago because I had to work on a renewal project, no TV in the house. So I was taken away. I'm glad I was. I noticed that I have to calm my amygdala a lot. Amygdala is the part of the brain that it's the reactive mind. And I have to calm it. So whenever I start getting upset and looking at the news, maybe I should just turn it off or ask myself, what am I so scared of that it's triggering me? And I don't need to let outside people control my behavior by triggering me, letting myself be triggered. So any more comments on that would be appreciated. I don't know how to get information. I don't like to use the computer, but I guess I could do that and find out what's going on. But I don't always have to know. It's a matter of trust that the world knows what's going, and to letting love being a principle of my life, trust the future, whatever it is. And that
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. There's a lot there in what you say. I'll be on the brief side because of time. I'm hearing, first of all, I was hearing about loss of your friend and, what would your friend want? And I'll just mention a practice that I've done with the loss of people close to me. And it's, it kind of came originally out of more of a Tibetan practice of being in communication for 49 days after the death. And I actually would just be in kind of dialogue and communication with the person who has departed, and just open up something like those communication lines. So I would actually talk, so to speak, with the person and have a dialogue, and I would often write them down what was occurring. And so I did that initially with my parents when they died, and I've actually stayed where I have a daily practice where I actually talk to my parents twice a day. And one could do that with ancestors as well, or friends. So that's part of what you were responding to. But I think in terms of, you're talking about the amygdala and being triggered, I think a key point came out in what you said, which is I think important for practice in general, which is knowing our state of mind, and when I'm being triggered or when there's a lot of reactivity, and knowing at those moments it's actually better not to stay with the stimulation or whatever is triggering, whether this is just sitting and getting really, really upset about something that happened, or, having traumatic reactivation or something like that. But I use a guideline in my teaching. I ask people to say, what's happening on a scale of intensity from 1 to 10, and basically see where the dividing line is between where you can be balanced with something and where you can't be balanced, where it's too much. And if it's too much, just end the stimulation, as when that's in your power. It's not always. And so that would be in relation to the news. So it really is about taking a pause, having mindfulness just in the day, and particularly listening to some news. Then, turn off the news, and, if it works to be mindful, be with what's happening, or maybe it's to just do whatever is necessary to come back to balance in that moment. Take a walk, do a heart practice, whatever helps. Yeah. So I think that would be an initial response, but just to take on these practices. And then I think the importance, which we see, I'll end with this, which we see manifest in our gathering here, is I think being part of a community is really, really crucial. So it could be having, maybe having a small group of 3-4 people that you check in with once a week, maybe for half an hour, something like that. So community Sangha plays a very important role, because one of the dangers of our time also is some degree of isolation or feeling a little disconnected, especially with the pandemic and so forth. So I would add that as a really crucial piece for all of us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, for bringing that up.
And now we'll do the dedication of merit. And Donna, would you like to do that, or should we go ahead and do our usual? What would you? We invite you to do the dedication.
Your choice. I can do it, or I'm curious what the usual is.
Well, we're curious about what your usual is. So, but if you like, we could go ahead and I'll go ahead and read this then. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness, which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity, without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives. And we will, we can hang out for another 15 minutes or so. We'll end for sure at 12:15 if people care to do that. And Donald, if you'd like to hang out, we invite you, or if you care to do so, we can ask you more questions if that
Okay.
seems all right. Whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Donald.
Thanks for a great talk, Donald.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
I was wondering, given the events of this week, whether, whether schadenfreude is a lesser transgression than anger.
You want to explain to people what?
Well, I think I experienced schadenfreude this week to see people that I'm usually angry about getting a little bit of having to face the consequences of some of their actions. I'm thinking politically now, and so I was just. I realized that schadenfreude is not a healthy state of mind, but it's maybe a little healthier than anger.
Okay. There's a lot there. People know schadenfreude is a German word meaning more or less happiness at the misfortune of others, or and particularly
The misfortune that others have brought upon themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think that anger is necessarily a problem. Actually, I think particularly in Dharma circles, I find a lot of confusion about anger, even connected with translations. That there are a lot of interesting issues there. So I think anger can be very destructive, or can lead to being destructive, but in itself, it's simply an emotion. But one wants to watch the storyline, the narrative carefully. And so I think, something which takes us away from universal compassion is something to look at. I think, anything which has my happiness dependent on someone else's suffering is a problem, right? At the same time, I think it's, maybe more of a focus practice to see, how do I relate to those who I find as my political opponents? How do I relate to them? How do I, and I think a lot of people can relate to this. I've noticed at times, probably all of us have, wishes for bad things to happen to certain people, or particularly one or two. How many people have noticed a negative thought about the well-being of the former president? That was what I was referring to.
No.
Yeah. right? And so that's interesting to notice, but that's something's off there. Again, what I have found generally in working with people with reactivity, and I think I got most clear about this doing work with transforming the judgmental mind, is that the judgmental mind can be a link of insight with reactivity. And I think that's what might be there with schadenfreude, or with some of what we're talking about, that we want to, like if I'm very judgmental of someone, I might be noticing something very important. That's good to know. We see this most clearly with social justice issues. I can notice injustice, and be very reactive in relationship to it. But I want to keep my insight into injustice and transform the reactivity. So that might be a way to approach schadenfreude, saying there's something there. I don't want to just suppress the whole thing, right? Because there's something there that is connected with insight, or, this person is a problem, or there are issues there, right? I don't want to suppress that, but I want to disconnect it from reactivity. That's a clear way of talking about it. Right? Yeah. Okay, it looks like, is it Zerlin?
Zerdan, yes. So I just wanted to share a little bit of a story because I have been around other monks and temples, and I've been in different situations where we've had to use the anger that comes up when things go wrong like that. And one of the terms that I've heard used is an inappropriate rejoicing instead of schadenfreude. I think that's how you say that word. And that you look for the actual thing to be rejoiceful in instead of being rejoiceful in the thing that brings harm.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to interject that thought. But the story that I had was there have been times in my life where I have actually worked as security at temples because sometimes people misbehave at temples.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we would do to train each other, I would be with other monks and we would talk about, what do we do if someone decides to get rowdy?
Mm-hmm.
And the main thing was just to remove them. And so I think that we see, there are many examples of removing the problem.
Mm-hmm.
That way it can be dealt with in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And then even if we took them outside and the altercation might continue, if we needed in some way to restrain them, we would coach each other. We would actually practice with each other. We'd say, okay, well, we're going to go to the floor now. If we need to actually restrain them in some way, they're acting out, they're getting physical, they can't restrain themselves, and we need to restrain them, then we would actually, we'd all kind of group around and we would practice with each other, but we'd act like, someone was being the inappropriate, violent person, and we'd get around them and say, okay, we're going down to the floor now. And as we're kind of taking them down, we would whisper in their ears things like, I'm very sorry, are you okay? Am I hurting you?
Yeah.
And so that good heart was really kept all the way through it.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so I just thought I would share that because sometimes things really do get out of control. But if we can keep our minds on, we're benefiting the people who want to continue their practice in the main temple area. So we're helping them. And we're also helping each other by reminding each other to not let it get out of control in our own minds. And at the same time, we are restraining that person. And they are not allowed to get out of control like that. So
Yeah.
All those things can happen simultaneously.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's really, and I could imagine having, almost like a compilation of different ways of, of keeping, whatever we call it, keeping the equanimity and compassion, the wisdom and compassion in a variety of challenging circumstances like the one you described. How do you do that? Right? How do you, it's been interesting for me because I've taught a fair amount on bringing dharmic resources into conflicts, right? Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, I've taught in Israel twice in the last several years before the pandemic, and I actually gave a talk in Jerusalem on how to be skillful with conflict, which was a certain amount of chutzpah to do the talk. But anyway, that's another story. And during the talk, I had a conflict manifest with one of the persons attending the talk. And so how do you, I think we could look to different situations. How do you have a meeting and have certain guidelines? And what do you do? How do you bring in compassion and the kind heart and balance when someone goes against those guidelines, right? Not necessarily physically rowdy, but it could be going against some guideline. Or how do you work just with a friend or someone when something gets a little bit out of hand? So I think something like that, and actually having ways that we know ahead of time that will bring the kind heart and wisdom into a challenging situation, and just name those, right? And even, I know, what came to mind just now was the way that in the civil rights movement, people did role plays. It's something I do when I teach on conflict. We do role plays. And so I could imagine it being a form of Buddhist practice where people do role plays on how to be with difficult circumstances. But in the civil rights movement, they did that, right? Maybe you've seen films of some of that where people would be with people calling them names or, beating them or hitting them. And how do you keep your connection with care and love and still deal with the situation? So I think having a list of some ways of dealing with that's really, really crucial. So thanks, Serdan.